thank you for the invitation to speak here. It feels good to be here. And I should say one footnote, when you were talking about the founding of the Black German movement in the 1980s, I was actually present. I wasn't part of the seminar with Audre Lorde, but I was present with Maya Ayim and those others when, we just met. It was basically meeting in someone's kitchen. There were 25 of us in 1986. I think it was the first meeting, and the discussions around the term Afro-German and so on. So let me just get to it. So what I'll do is I'll give a brief initial history of Afrofuturism. I've cut out some of the stuff because they were covered in the two wonderful keynotes last night. So I'll just gesture to them. And then I'll talk a little bit about what one of my graduate students terms the Black aquatic. Because there are several pieces in the exhibit that speak to that, and just very, very briefly highlight some newer developments within Afrofuturism without duplicating too much what Ingrid Lafleur said last night. Can you still hear me, even if I'm not in the microphone? Yes? Okay. Oh no, back. So, I guess I should get out my talk. I'm still working on the whole getting awake thing, so bear with me. So, trying to summarize, and I should also say that in terms of Afrofuturism, it's been something that I've been interested in for a really long time, and I, for a number of years, taught classes at Northwestern in both African American and Afro-diasporic speculative fiction, and then in more recent years in specifically Afrofuturism. So Afrofuturism comprises different artistic and conceptual approaches that focus on the connections between science fiction, technology, and Black culture. Afrofuturism excavates the important function of everyday technologies in Afro-diasporic and Black cultures globally, and imagines alternate Black pasts, presents, and futures. And I will get to the civilization bit to the civilization part in a bit. And I also want to say, because I think, and I think that the two keynotes last night were really wonderful in terms of highlighting different aspects of Afrofuturism. And one of the things that I think that has sort of happened with Afrofuturism as it has moved more into the mainstream is that the kind of nitty-gritty techness of it, right? The everyday technology part has sort of moved to the background, and the speculative aspect moved to the foreground. But for me, at least, both of those things were always present, and also the fact that it was never only about some empty future, right? So my brief history of Afrofuturism. In 1993, Mark Derry publishes an interview with Samuel Delany, science fiction writer, critic Greg Tate, and academic Tricia Rose, where he uses the term Afrofuturism for the first time. And I think that even though these ideas existed before, having that term really galvanized the discussion and centralized it in ways that perhaps it would not have been centralized otherwise. And then a few other points, John Corbett in his essay on Lee Perry, George Clinton and Sun Ra, and then a kind of filmic manifesto for Afrofuturism, John Akomfrah's The Last Angel of History that appeared in 1996. And then within the German context, I think it's also important to highlight the Loving the Alien conference and the resulting anthology. The conference took place in Berlin in 1996, I believe, or 1997, I'm sorry, and then the anthology came out in 1998, and then of course also in 1998, Koja Ashun's More Brilliant Than the Sun, sort of, even though it was not an avowed book about Afrofuturism, it served as a book-length rumination on particularly Afrofuturism in the history of Black music. And then something that perhaps is also not quite as present as it should be in these discussions. In 1999, Alondra Nelson, who's now, by the way, the dean at Columbia University of the Humanities and Social Sciences, founded a listserv for Afrofuturism. And I think, again, there a lot of the debates coalesced and came together. And this is Ytasha Womack writing about the Afrofuturism listserv in 2015, saying that she launched this AOL listserv, Alondra Nelson, for students and artists who wanted to explore ideas about technology, space, freedom, and culture. And that it was important that it took place on the internet. And I should say that it wasn't only students and artists who participated in the Afrofuturism listserv, but it was also designers, programmers, et cetera, and so on, so that you got a really, really wide swath of Black people thinking about technology and science fiction. And that was a really important space for a number of us for 3 or 4 years. And I think initially the debates on the listserv were very much limited to strictly Afrofuturist topics, but it expanded very soon to talk about a number of different other things relating to Black culture and technology from different perspectives. And so the question then is, there we go. Why does Afrofuturism come up at this particular moment, right? As a term, as an idea, as a movement from the mid to late 1990s. And I think, again, this is something that that perhaps has moved into the background. I think in part thanks to Afrofuturist discourses, there was a frustration for many of us during that period, because the primary way in which Black cultures and technologies were discussed were through the lens of the digital divide, right? And I think, of course, the digital divide existed then, and it exists now on a global scale within the United States, right? And here I'm just going to quote from Alondra Nelson's Future Texts. That's the introduction to the first journal-length journal issue on Afrofuturism, where actually every single essay and the artwork in the book was from someone who was on the Afrofuturism listserv. That appeared in 2002. Someone recently joked, I ran into someone from the listserv that I'd never met, actually, and they suggested that we do like some kind of 15-year reunion. And I'm still in touch with many, many people. But in any case, going back to this from the listserv, the digital divide, a phrase, has been used to describe gaps in technological access that fall along the lines of race, gender, region, and ability, but has mostly become a code word for tech inequities that exist between Blacks and whites. Forecasts of a utopian to some race-free future and pronouncements of the dystopian digital divide are the predominant discourses of Blackness and technology in the public sphere. And Afrofuturism very much intervened in that discourse, right? And I think that perhaps the sort of the celebratory arm of Afrofuturist discourses really comes from that, and at the in the initial moment, always having to insist that there were other ways of thinking about Black culture and technology that weren't only about deficit, right? So I think that this goes back to a much broader and longer and still with us discourses about how technology, particularly within colonialism and the in the context of racial slavery, was a mark of civilization. Right? And seeing that Blackness was often and still is imagined within the realm of the primitive, there were all these different ways in which Blackness and technology could not go together, right? And one of the things that I try to do in phonographies is to highlight how black cultures had been innovative, particularly in the realm of sound technologies since the end of the 19th century. And even though it's an oldie, it still is a goodie. One of my favorite ways to think about how this discourse around technology, primitivism, and civilizational primitivism and blackness functions is through Samuel Delany. This is from his piece that was in the Mark Derry essay about Afrofuturism from 1993, where he talks about the difference between the white boxes of computer technology and the black boxes of modern street technology. And he says here, above all, it comes in matte plastic boxes, from beepers, the Walkman, the Discman, through the biggest ghetto blaster. Stuff put forward as portable is not chromium. This is 1993, okay? It's black. The black boxes of modern street technology or the white boxes of computer technology, not an accidental distinction, I'm sure. Put us in a very, very different relationships to the inner workings, end quote. Although things have changed somewhat since Delany made the statement in 1993 due to the proliferation of mobile devices and the move away from white boxes as a de facto model for personal computing, Delany's distinction still holds, both in its general implications and in the racialized provenances of this split. As recent studies have shown, for instance, most youth of color in the United States, particularly Black and Latino youth, still log onto the internet from mobile devices or public personal computer terminals, and thus still only have access to the black boxes of modern street technology. And of course, Black and Latino youth have also been early adopters of these street technologies, whether it's the current mobile devices or portable music players, and so on. And the thing is, though, that generally the pioneering use of, of mobile black boxes, such as pagers or boom boxes in non-mainstream cultures, do not figure into the histories of cellular telephones. So that, for instance, if you look at, I also used to teach a class, The Culture of Mobile Technologies, where we looked at the history of mobile technologies, but also how mobile technologies functioned within a global scale, particularly on the African continent. And one of the things that becomes really obvious in terms of the histories of mobile telephones is that the pager technology, which was associated in the United States in the 1990s with drug dealers, black drug dealers, not surprisingly, is something that usually gets written out of that history, even though we wouldn't have text messaging without that pager technology and its use within black culture. And of course, there's, as I mentioned, also sonic technologies have played in an important role. So the question then is, it's not only about highlighting technology, but also fundamentally thinking about what we consider to be technological and not, right? That it's not only about the iPhone, right? Of course, even though it's there, but that there are all these other technologies that, because they've been around longer, don't necessarily seem technological to us anymore, particularly in the global north. And then just very, very briefly, in terms of the history of Afrofuturism, examples from literature, Octavia Butler, who also graces my shirt, Samuel Delany, Nalo Hopkinson, and then earlier incarnations of that. And one of the things that Afrofuturism initially did for a lot of people was not only highlight what was going on in the contemporary moment, but to also go back and excavate and reread canonical African-American authors such as Toni Morrison and Ralph Ellison, but also slave narratives, for instance, and read them from an Afrofuturist slash speculative lens, right? Highlighting the continuities and disruptions between the past and the present. And of course, Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany being marketed through white characters on their cover, even though if one reads the books, it's very clear that the characters are not white because the genre of science fiction was not imagined to be a space for blackness. I should also say that both Delany and Octavia Butler are not only black speculative fiction writers, but also queer, even though Butler didn't necessarily identify herself that way, but I think we can claim her. So I'll just stay with that. And then a few examples from visual art. Basquiat, of course, then a few Chicago artists. There's also, with Krista Franklin and a few others in Chicago, Colleen Smith would be another example of a contemporary artist that's working directly in the idiom of Afrofuturism, but there are also several artists that work in, such as Krista Franklin, that work in what they call Afro-surrealism, right? I think that in general, and I'll get back to this at the end, that for a number of particularly visual artists that they have increasingly felt dissatisfied with the term Afrofuturism and have been looking for new ways to think about these questions. Here, the transatlantic turntablism, also the aquatic there. And then within the German context, Afro-German artist Daniel Kojo-Schrader, who teaches at Amherst, I think, somewhere in the States. And this is from a series, Afronaut series from 2005. And then, of course, in music, we have Sun Ra, George Clinton, Lee Perry, Detroit Techno, Janelle Monáe. I'm not going to get into the details because then we would be here until tomorrow. But what I wanted to highlight was that one of the things that Afrofuturism really brought to the forefront was this relationship between science fiction, particularly the Black diasporic experience, and enslavement, right? Greg Tate and Kojo Ashun talking about the Middle Passage as a form of alien abduction, right? Or Kojo Ashun saying that during the Middle Passage, excuse me, Black people were literally synthesized into a new race, right? Since Blackness in that way did not exist before the Middle Passage, and everybody came from different cultures, languages, religions, etc., and so on. And here, Ashun says from a later essay, further considerations on Afrofuturism, Afrofuturism therefore stages a series of enigmatic returns to the constitutive trauma of slavery in light of science fiction. And I think that also opened up a lot of possibilities for Black artists, thinkers, to imagine and reimagine the past, right, that had been erased through the Middle Passage violently. And one of the main ways this has occurred is through the Black aquatic, right, which is concerned centrally, of course, with the Atlantic Ocean, but not exclusively so, right? And here are a few vessels, so to speak, right, of the Black aquatic, the slave ship, George Clinton's mothership, Garvey's The Black Star Line, Lee Perry's Black Ark, but of course also in the contemporary moment, the refugee boat, right? All of those things are present within that. And a few of the concepts that historians and other theorists have used in order to think about this Black aquatic is the oceanic, Hortense Spillers writes about this going back to Freud, then the littoral, right, the coastal. This is Stephanie Smallwood in her study of the Middle Passage that she uses. I'm not going to be able to pronounce this word, this archipelagic, which has been really important, particularly in Caribbean theorizations, right? In Edward Glissant's work, for instance, but also Sylvia Wynter, and then more generally, the maritime and the submarine, right? And a few of the concepts, the Black aquatic, of course, Gilroy's The Black Atlantic, and then Omasike Tinsley's The Black Queer Atlantic, right, where she excavates the Black Atlantic as a space where queerness happens on the slave ship and after, right, both real and imagined. And then a few of the kind of imaginary spaces of the Black aquatic, Canaan, of course, then Atlantis. Herbie Hancock has an album named Atlantis, and Sun Ra, of course, who has an album named after everything because he released so much, has an album named Atlantis, and then Drexciya, whom I'll talk about in a few moments. And I think that what the aquatic has given Black musicians, visual artists, writers, and theorists is a way to talk and think about the Middle Passage that also allows for this kind of abstraction and creativity, right? And of course, a certain kind of openness as well by focusing on the actual and the inactual space of the ocean and other bodies of water as well, in a way that only focusing on the slave ships would not have opened up those possibilities, if that makes sense. And here, this is part of the exhibit, the Otolith Group Hydra Decapita, and they describe it here as, and I'm just going to quote here, by seceding from the political category, the philosophical claim, and ontological condition of the human, Drexciya retroacted received ideas of the post-human as a coming condition. The Drexciya myth was nothing less than a redeeming of the biopolitical atrocity of the Middle Passage, a revisionist electronic song cycle in which the implications of financial speculation of trade, as we heard a little bit earlier, whose promise to pay was ensured by cargoes of bodies, were carried over into the fictional speculation on death, marine evolution, terracentricity, and post-humanity, end quote. And there are a number of other artists that have also made use of the aquatic, both the representation of slave ships. There are a number of representations of the Zong, for instance, right? And I think, I won't talk about her now, but I'm happy to talk about in questions and answers. A Black British artist, Ellen Gallagher, has done some amazing work with the aquatic as well. But because of the limits of time, and because she's in the exhibit, Wangechi Mutu also has a series of watery works. And Wangechi Mutu is one of the artists that actually distances herself from the term and grouping Afrofuturism at this point in time. So these are, this is the curtain on losing her mind and heart in the Duddy water. But on to Drexciya. So Drexciya imagines the space of the Atlantic Ocean, as we just heard from the Otolith Group, as this space where those who were thrown, jumped, fell overboard, creates this new hybrid, hybrid species, right? And what is interesting about their project is that it, I misspelled experiments there, I'm just noticing. In any case, moving right along, this tie between the present, the future, and the past, right? That they really zero in on that within within this context that you see here, right? That they have these three different maps, these three different stages. That there's the slave trade, of course, which we're familiar with. Then the Great Migration within the United States, right? Which allows Detroit to become Detroit, and then at some point in the 1980s, the creation of Detroit Techno. But then there's also this imagined journey home, right? Going back to the Black Star Line, et cetera, and so on. And as much as I love Drexciya, I think their mythology also highlights what I think has become one of the limitations of Afrofuturism, is in that the way that they imagine this new species being created is through Black women's bodies as these vessels, right? Even though the rest of the mythology is fairly masculinist, to put it somewhat mildly, right? And of course, there's also a limit in terms of just how the reproduction, right, of this new species and production of species is being imagined within a fairly heteronormative framework as well. And I think that in general, this has become one of the limitations of certain strands of popularized Afrofuturism, is that it sort of kind of becomes this sort of great, weird black man version of Afrofuturist history, right? Through Sun Ra, through et cetera, and so on. And it's not as if one could not say interesting things about Sun Ra's queerness, et cetera, and so on. But usually that is not what is what is done, right? And of course, female artists such as Grace Jones or Betty Davis, et cetera, and so on, and LaBelle are usually not part of that genealogy as well. The other limitation, let me just move on here, is that in sort of its travels, right, through social networks such as Tumblr and other kind of popular manifestations, that Afrofuturism oftentimes is sort of reduced to the shiny space travel aspect of it, right? And that the kind of radical political edge that it had initially is something that gets that gets lost along the way, which goes hand in hand with its kind of heteromasculinization, even though, as we heard yesterday, and as I've been saying, that most of the practitioners have been either women or queer people, right? And or, not or. So a few of the things, and I'm glad that Ingrid talked about a lot of them, that I think have sort of kept the spirit of Afrofuturism, at least in the way that I like to imagine it, alive, is sort of taking it into real life through politics, community activism, through Afrofuturist Affair, Octavia's Brood, and Afrotopia. And what I want to spend a few minutes, my final minutes here talking about, is what I think was one of the best and most interesting and novel theoretical interventions in Afrofuturist discourse in the last few years, which is Martine Sims's Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto. And I think that was very much a response to the kind of reduction of Afrofuturism to this shiny male space travel idea. And she says here, the imaginative challenge that awaits any mundane Afrofuturist author who accepts that this is it. Earth is all we have. What will we do with it, right? The chastening, but hopefully enlivening effect of imagining a world without fantasy bolt holes. No portals to the Egyptian kingdoms, no deep dives to Drexciya, no flying Africans to whisk us off to the promised land. The possibilities of a new focus on Black humanity, our science, technology, politics, religions, culture, individuality, dreams, hopes, and failings. The search of bedazzlement and wonder, bedazzlement, cosmos, stardust, and wonder that awaits us as we contemplate our own cosmology of blackness and our possible futures. And I think that it's not as if clearly Sims is rejecting Afrofuturism, but I think she's challenging writers, thinkers, musicians, artists, etc., and so on, to not be as limited, in terms of how they imagine Afrofuturism, and to actually also take what is real and existing and use that as a springboard, as opposed to always having to go to these otherworldly spaces, right? And I think, of course, because it's a manifesto, there's also a certain kind of polemical edge to it. And she gives us a number of different, categories, just a few, that there should not be no inexplicable end to racism, that there shouldn't be any aliens, no Martians and Venusans, and no forgetting. And I think this is this is really where her intervention comes into focus. No forgetting about political, racial, social, economic, and geographical struggles, so that if Afrofuturism is to remain viable, it has to be connected to the struggles and the practices within tech, within art, within politics that are already taking place on the ground. So thank you. That's it.
Okay, so I will start off with a first question. Yesterday, we saw in Inge Lafleur's keynote lecture how Afrofuturism has become this major movement, and how Hollywood also draws on that by publishing or by releasing Black Panther. And this is a great movement, and it's a great sign of recognition of this movement. But if we look at the history of Black cultural production, there's always also a history of white appropriation, right? If you look at jazz in the early 20th century, which has been taken up, rock and roll, in the 70s hip hop. I grew up thinking that techno was a white culture, that it was born in Berlin and not born in Detroit. And so
most people in the United States actually think that too.
Okay. So yeah, what do you think about this? I mean, do we have to be more skeptical about this, or is it an empowerment, or how can the culture, how can Afrocentrism?
I don't necessarily think we have to be skeptical of Black Panther or Wrinkle in Time themselves. I mean, I think the problem for me would be if that's all there is, right? If it gets sort of limited to that particular kind of representation of Afrofuturism, and I think that there just needs to be a diversity in the representations and the cultural forms that are available, and I think the problem usually is when something gets to that level of popularity, right, that it tends to move everything else into the background, right? Particularly things that don't necessarily fit into a certain kind of template. And and I mean, in terms of the appropriation question, I mean, generally what tends to happen, it hasn't really happened with hip hop that much, but with the earlier musical genres, right, and then up to techno and including techno, is that in general, once that appropriation happens, Black people come up with something else, right, and move on, because that it's not it's not really a viable option anymore. But I do think, of course, there's a question there, in terms of the in terms of access to power, finances, et cetera, and so on. I don't really think we have in my. I'm teaching a Black popular music class now, and this is one of the main things that we keep coming back to, is the whole appropriation question. And for me, it's always yes, there is appropriation. It's basically always going to happen, but the moment when it becomes critical for me is, when does it become violent and or exploitative, right? And I think that to highlight those aspects more rather than only the appropriation is much more important for me in terms of keeping our eyes on the prize, so to speak. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Since you mentioned hip-hop, and since one of your research projects also deals with R&B, I was wondering if you could explain the role of hip-hop and R&B music in the Afrofuturist movement.
I think for It's a very complicated question. I mean, yes, hip hop, of course. I think people are more are more open to that, and Africa Bambaataa and Ram LZ have sort of been in the pantheons, and for some people, of course, also Missy Elliott's work in the 1990s in her in her videos, although she doesn't appear nearly as frequently as the other two. I think with R&B, it's a little bit more complicated because there's not always the space iconography. So that people tend to think about R&B as not being futurist in any kind of way, that it gets sort of relegated to the realm of, I don't know, I'm trying to come up with a nice word I'll just leave it. It just gets relegated to the margins. Let me put it that way. And I think that partially that also has something to do with the fact that in the aftermath of hip hop sort of ascendancy to as this kind of global sign of blackness, that R&B has sort of become a very feminized genre, right? Most of the prominent performers are female. It's perceived to be not as ruggedly masculine as hip hop, even though hip hop wouldn't really exist without R&B. So there are a lot of interesting things going on there. For me, R&B is really important because it has steadfastly maintained and highlighted black interiority and interpersonal relationships in a way that hip hop is not particularly interested in. I mean, of course, it's also about interpersonal relationships, but it's not really in the same in the same way that R&B is. And I think it's been really interesting to kind of see all these pushes of people in the age of Black Lives Matter of saying, this art needs to be explicitly pro-black in its lyrics and things like that, and artists kind of resisting that dictum, but finding all these different ways to actually still politicize in different ways what it is they're singing about. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, and I'm writing a paper on this, there's a Somali-Canadian R&B singer, Amal Nuh is her name, and she has this song called Scream, and the chorus is, scream my name like a protest. So it's like this intimate situation between her and her lover, but she's sort of talking about wanting her lover to scream her name as if they were at a Black Lives Matter rally, right? And it's not saying Black Lives Matter, and it's not saying what kind of protest, but it's really clear that that is what is being envisioned. And I thought that that was like a really beautiful and poetic way of actually making that link, right? Because just because you're focusing on, the living room or the bedroom and not the street, so to speak, right? That doesn't mean that the street completely vanishes, right? And I think so in that way, for me, maybe it's not Afrofuturist in the narrower sense, but I do think that R&B opens up all these kinds of spaces that oftentimes hip hop at this point in time mostly denies, right? For a variety of different different reasons. So.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and also what you say also reminds me of the feminist slogan, "The personal is political."
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
All right. Are there questions, comments? Yes.
Hello. It's not on. Is it on? Yeah. Hello. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I just had a question to see. I don't know. I don't want to start a big debate, but it would be interesting just to see your thoughts, perhaps. Just because I just discovered your work very recently through Kojo Eshin. So, and then he showed me the book of yours where you engage with the work of Hortense Spillers and Sylvia Winter. And then you just mentioned this, like, the mundane Afro-Futurist manifesto from Martine Sims. And she says that phrase that you just showed, number 2, like, no inexplicable end to racism. The structures of white supremacy is so difficult to break down, et cetera, something like that. And then I'm just thinking, it's always been something I thought about in relationship with Afrofuturism, is like the sort of difficulties that posed on the continent as such, and what the relationship was within African diasporic visions of, let's say, beginning with Black Star Liner, these kind of projects. And then we read something like Lose Your Mother, for example, by Saidiya Hartman. So I mentioned these people, Saidiya Hartman, Hortense Spillers, Sylvia Winter, to wonder what your take might be on the recent developments in Afro-pessimism and how that gets fed into, you know, I'd just be interested to hear what you would say about that, if anything.
I have many things to say. No, it's just really funny because my running joke is like whenever I go anywhere, talk about anything, at some point someone will ask me about Afro-pessimism.
Oh, okay.
And I thought this was kind of like a safe space, but of course there are no safe spaces, as we know. No, but you know, I mean, it's not really my cup of tea, so to speak. Overall, they're ideas that I engage with and that I think are important. I think that there's kind of there's certain limitations in Afro-pessimist discourses that I'm not particularly interested in working through. That's not, you know, my field to work over, so to speak. And I think, you know, I mean, for me, one of the main limitations of Afro-pessimist discourse is that until very recently, it hasn't really had any language to think about gender and sexuality in relationship to blackness, right? And I mean, there's kind of like the lip service to Hortense Spillers and Sylvia Winter, not Sylvia Winter, but Saidiya Hartman's work. But beyond that, there's not really any sustained engagement with that. And but on the other hand, I also think, you know, just in terms of being a teacher, that Afro-pessimism has really sort of politicized a lot of students that come in having read Afro-pessimism, and generally I have to have many debates with them about them actually reading other people beyond the Afro-pessimists. Because I mean, that's the other thing, where it's sort of this kind of Afro-pessimism not only becomes the lens through which all black thought is seen, but it's sort of, you know, oftentimes, especially with the younger folks, there's not really any moving beyond that, right? So that there's a kind of, I don't know, I'm just not going to say anything because I know I'll regret it later, because it is a small world and things, you know, travel very, very fast these days. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it has its legitimacy. It has done some really, really good things. I think it's kind of sort of polemical and dramatic edge, as I said, has politicized a lot of young black scholars, and I'm grateful for that. But there are also, you know, limitations. And for me, my intellectual genealogy is sort of through black feminism and thinking about queerness and gender through that. And so it's not. I wouldn't necessarily locate myself within that. And I also think that there's this way that Afrofuturism oftentimes gets positioned against Afro-pessimism. That would not be my reading of Afrofuturism, right? It's not only about the shiny celebratory future. It is also about a lot of other things. And I would say, you know, something such as Hartman's Lose Your Mother is also an Afrofuturist text to a certain extent, right? It's just not about shiny space travel. So, thank you.
No, thanks. I mean, yeah, just to come back to that, I mean, that's precisely why I think that, you know, this, like you bring up the mundane Afrofuturist manifesto is precisely such an important thing right now.
Yes.
Just like you mean to kind of work towards this sort of demasculinization of the project, and also to situate it in a more contemporary moment, which is taking into consideration things like the total afterlife of slavery, for example.
Yeah,
anyway.
Definitely. So, thank you.
Okay, there's a question over there.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. That was very enlightening. It got me thinking about stuff I hadn't really thought about in a very long time. I'm a creative from Nairobi, Kenya, and what I find is that most creatives are the ones who tell the story. But what I find happening in Africa is that we talk a lot about the past and the present. The future is this blind place that no one really gets into. How would you suggest we engage creatives to talk about the future and imagine a future that's different? I like the trailer of Black Panther because it does a lot of that. But I haven't seen many people engage in that direction. So, yeah.
You're asking me to be prescriptive, which is not really my thing. I mean, I think that there are different ways of, and I'm not trying to be evasive, just FYI. I'm just saying that there are a number of different ways to think about the future or different kinds of futures. And for me, I guess the useful thing about Afrofuturism still is that it opens up all these different ways of imagining Black people in some kind of future, right? Or some kind of other space that is not only the here and now, right? So I mean, I would just generally, my general motto would be with start where you're at, right? And use that. In terms of imagining a future. I think, you know, that sometimes, and I'm not excluding myself from this at all, that we do ourselves a disservice because there's this idea that if we imagine some kind of futurity, that it has to be like this set world and et cetera and so on, right? But I think, you know, although I wouldn't necessarily put it within the framework of crime, but the question that was asked on the panel earlier, right, that to me is sort of a beginning, and the responses that that both the speakers had, that's sort of a beginning to think about what might a different future mean. And the other thing I also think is that's important to remember is that change doesn't always have to be global and or systemic, right? That I think that I think, you know, creating different spaces that are local, limited in time, et cetera, and so on, is also really important, right? Just to be able to take the next steps. So I mean, I do think that in that way, because the kind of models that we have for change are usually global, lasting. They don't work, but you know, that's beside the point. And I think precisely because they're always imagined at the level of globality and systematicity, as opposed to thinking about it as something local, right? So I would highlight within your context what is already being done, right? What kind of spaces are already being created, and to use that to move into the future, right? And you can also go back into the past and look at what has existed there that has made change. So, for instance, just to give you an example, one of the things that the Black Panthers did in the 1960s and early 1970s was to create freedom schools, an alternate schooling system, right? This is also, there was a model that also existed in the UK in a much more limited way. And they, of course, at some point ceased to exist with a few exceptions, but that idea has been reanimated in Chicago, for instance, in the last 5 years, right? In order to create space for young people to have access to an educational system that is not, that is not completely colonial and violent, right? So that would be one thing, right? You go back to the past, and then you use that to move forward to the future. And I don't know enough about your particular context to speak on that, but that's kind of what I would use as a model.
So, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one last short question and one short answer. No, you all want to go out for lunch? Okay. Well, Professor Weheliye, it was really great talking to you. Thank you for coming to Dortmund and sharing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.